Hey, Adapters, welcome back. Joining me again is Judge Alice Hill. Alice is a David Rubenstein Senior Fellow at Council on Foreign Relations. Alice's work at CFR focuses on the risks, consequences, and responses associated with climate change. Alice previously served as Special Assistant to President Obama and Senior Director for Resilience Policy on the National Security Council staff, where she led the development of national policy to build resilience to catastrophic risks. Policymaking at the highest level of government remains a mystery to many. The Obama White House applied an effective formula to push forward an aggressive climate agenda. The secret? Focusing on outcomes. Today, Alice will share with us lessons from the Obama White House and how climate policy really got done. Hey, Alice, welcome back.
Oh, thank you for having me. What a pleasure.
Long time no see, Alice. Okay, so we're going to be talking about your time at the Obama White House, and this is great. I'm a political junkie, and I have questions that I can look at, but I probably don't even need those. And so, let's just start. You wrote an article about this. Well, it's actually a chapter in a book. Can you give a little bit of background on that?
Sure, I was invited to contribute a chapter about President Obama and how he led climate efforts to a book edited by three superstars in the climate field. That's Claude Henry, Johan Rockstrom, and Nicholas Stern. I was just super honored to be asked to do this. So my chapter focuses on what I experienced, and that was an extraordinary run of leadership that proved that focus and accountability really can drive an agenda at the highest levels of government.
Okay, so in the chapter, you argue that there were three factors that contributed to the progress during President Obama's time there. What were those factors?
Well, among them was a focus. And the first of that is that in the federal government, because it's really sprawling and large in Washington, D.C., there is a common tendency to hold a lot of meetings to communicate information, to share ideas, to make sure that people understand what's coming ahead. And that's just built into any policymaking approach. But under President Obama, and particularly with John Podesta, when he was his senior counselor on these issues, it was clear that he understood process is part of the decision making, but really, what is the deliverable that you're going to have? And then an agenda was set to make sure that there was a rollout on a regular basis of the announcements. And that created an impression that everything was moving forward. And finally, there was a willingness to take a stand where needed to push policy further ahead when there was internal disputes, to try to make sure that it didn't get stalled out if there were good reasons for going forward.
Well, the chapter makes for a great read. I loved it. I've mentioned in the past, I have my own federal experience, and a lot of what you bring up in the chapter is timing. And it seems like that first term, I don't know if you'd call it a missed opportunity, but there's the politics at play. And then John Podesta, you'd mentioned that he's a fascinating character, obviously a major player in the DC scene, but that was the second term. Could you kind of elaborate on the whole timing aspect in regards to getting anything done?
Sure. Well, if you recall, in the leading up to the election, climate change was really not a focus in 2008. But President Obama had some intentions to advance the climate agenda. Unfortunately, in that first term, it really ran into some headwinds. There was an international meeting that did not go well and left many wondering. President Obama showed up at the last minute. What value did he bring in showing up at the last minute? And then there was a breakdown. There was going to be the idea of big legislation to address carbon emissions. That never happened. It ground to a halt. So the first term had not gone as planned, and felt a little, I think, left the whole environmental and climate community somewhat disappointed. But then President Obama was elected, and right before that election, Hurricane Sandy or Superstorm Sandy slammed into Manhattan. And one of the things that is true in policymaking is that if there's a crisis, and this is what Obama's first first chief of staff said, Rahm Emanuel, never let a good crisis go to waste. Hurricane Sandy was a crisis for the nation. It really introduced the concept that these bigger storms could bring a city and a region to its knees. So from that, there was concerted effort to learn to do better. It was what I call in a book I co-authored a no more moment, where a community says, we're not going to have that happen again. And to some extent, the federal government said, hey, we got to do better to prepare. We're not going to have that kind of devastation again. And President Obama used that event to great advantage. And he also brought on John Podesta. And importantly, President Obama was in the second of his 2 terms. One thing that we see with politicians on the local, national level is that climate sometimes becomes a legacy issue for them if they're nearing the end of their terms. It's an expression, NIMT, not in my term for many politicians, because there are other more seemingly urgent issues, crime, education, just making sure the potholes are filled, that take up the time of a politician. But in their last years, they tend to look at what can have a lasting legacy, and certainly making progress on climate is one of those. So that's what happened in the second term. President Obama was all in on climate to really commit to doing as much as possible within the scope of the powers that he had available.
Well, Superstorm Sandy is a character in your chapter. It was just made for compelling reading. And in your own experience working for the federal government National Security Council, you could talk to scientists, and just during all that period, they're consistent. Here's the threat. It's getting worse. There was no sort of roller coaster in support for it or not. The scientists are very consistent. And how is that you have to, play the politics of whoever's in the administration, but how did that play into, I guess, what your position there and what you were seeing, that because the scientists were absolutely consistent even through all that, even before Superstorm Sandy?
Right. And it wasn't that the science had changed at all. It was just that we had a visualization of what the science was telling us in how Superstorm Sandy occurred. So I think that the scientists during my tenure in the White House were absolutely partners in all of this. And one of the things that they welcomed and wanted to work on themselves is improving science communication. Sometimes the scientists had communicated and emphasized the uncertainty in climate change, but it was realized that there's so many areas where we are certain that it hasn't changed, that if we emphasize those and help people understand those, we could get greater recognition of what the true stakes were. And so when I was in the White House, I worked with the President's science advisor, Dr. John Holdren, and his team at the Office of Science, Technology, and Policy. And we were true partners. I was in the National Security Council's staff, but we worked together to promote different projects, including creating a web presence with the Climate Resilience Toolkit for the nation, to working on a number of executive orders designed to address the threats we were facing. And I think that's a very important model. The policymakers need to work with the scientists to make sure that the policy reflects accurately the science. And the scientists need to work with the policymakers to understand how their science can better inform the decisions made by policymakers. And that's one of the real challenges that has bedeviled, in my opinion, climate work, is that those two groups have been somewhat separate. And in the White House, we were all working together so we could communicate more forcefully really what the picture was and why people should care.
Okay, so let's go back to John Podesta just really briefly. And so one of the reasons he was brought in is just this extensive government experience, and he understands the bureaucracy, and people don't really understand, if you want to get things done, you need to understand how that works. So a lot of progress was made but you do acknowledge in the chapter, like, okay, well, these are all executive branch approaches to climate change. The Congress just was not, 2010, famously the Tea Party, the Republicans took over the House. So, what happens there? What happened with Donald Trump being elected president in regards to all that progress being made?
Well, President Trump rolled back a lot of that work, particularly because there wasn't congressional agreement. It had been done by executive order. That's when the president orders things within his or her powers to be done by the federal government. Sometimes, and those executive orders have been around for a long time, sometimes executive orders last for 40 years, and no president and successively elected touches them. The federal agencies just keep building and improving whatever they're doing in response to those orders. But President Trump came in with an agenda. He didn't reverse all of the orders that President Obama had done in climate space, but he reversed a lot of them. And that highlighted one of the vulnerabilities of this go it alone approach when you're in a highly polarized and divided Congress and you can't get to agreement and the president marches forward. So it got rolled back during Trump, and it also created an impression for the rest of the world, which I encounter all the time, that the United States is fickle and that we're not a trustworthy partner. We said we were going to lead on climate, and then we reversed everything. We said we were going to do a variety of things to help the world address the impacts of climate change, and we haven't really honored those. So there's deep skepticism, and now we have a new president who has entered into the climate action fight in a way that we've never seen before, much more attention, much more energy than even in the Obama administration. But that reputation of fickleness is still overshadowing a bit the relations of the United States with other countries. There's a skepticism. Can the United States deliver when it's clear that our Congress is deeply split, that the American people are less split, but they're still pretty split on the issue of climate change? Can the United States really deliver given those politics? And that will be an issue that the Biden administration will be addressing for quite some time to prove that whatever it does has more lasting value than what happened, at least some of the efforts done under the Obama administration.
Well, one of the ways in my own experiences in the federal government of baking in some of these long-term changes is tie budgets to it. So like Superstorm Sandy, long-term funding for projects, things that outlived the Obama administration. And so it's not the best way to do things, but these funding mechanisms might last a decade or whatever, and they're still funding resilience projects. They might change the name, but there's ways to try to sneak in, I guess, longer term, executive approaches.
Yes, and one thing that became clear is if the Biden administration acts very early and so far they are getting these executive orders out now so that the agencies start creating regulations in response to the executive orders, that also further embeds it. What happened, because it was in the second term, these executive orders came later and there wasn't as much time for regulation making. So it was easier to rescind a lot of the work by the Trump administration.
So what would you recommend, just based on your own experience in the federal government? And it is, we talked about the rest of the world thinking how fickle we are. I think Americans say that. I think there's this sort of fatalism that we've had 2 years here, right? But there's no, I mean, maybe might not be 2 years of sort of, potential, legislative action, but just truly, take advantage of the opportunity. What would you recommend for like climate action over the next 2 years, I guess?
Well, we've seen a bit of it already, making sure that you are ambitious, but ruthlessly prioritize what you think is most important to get done. And focus, focus, focus. One of the really hard things for particularly political appointees as they're starting in government is that the urgent, the everyday demands, a crisis here, a crisis there, overcomes the important. And now climate is a crisis and it's urgent, but you have other things that might require, a terrorist attack or some other immediate response is needed that forces the setting aside of the work. So it's very important that the leadership carves out teams, people, and an agenda that keeps moving no matter what other crises are hitting. Because just with any longer term project, it tends to get kicked to the side, and that will be highly detrimental to proving that the United States can actually deliver on these issues. So right now, they need to make sure that those who have climate in their titles and who are responsible for climate have the space and resources and support to get the job done. And that means maybe others will have to be the responders to the crisis while we have a group focus on just what can we accomplish in terms of climate action during this precious moment that we have.
Okay, Alice, it was a great chapter, just a fun read for me. I have my own biases why I think it was so fun, but I encourage other people. And the whole book covers a lot of ground in that regard. So definitely recommend. And I think it's all available free too. The chapters you can just download as
Yes.
PDFs, and so
Yes, it's one of those online free things. It's wonderful.
yeah, it's
And the contributors are just top notch. So I do highly recommend it.
We'll include a link to that here within this episode guide. But before I let you go, what's up next? You mentioned earlier some of the writing that you're doing now. What are some of the other areas that you're focusing on, and what are some upcoming pieces maybe?
Well, one of the exciting things coming out of the pandemic is this global experience with catastrophic risk has, in my opinion, increased focus on climate change and what are some of the solutions. And we're seeing a lot of movement in the financial markets, the increase of green bonds. Those are offerings to raise money that are labeled green. We're seeing ESG, environmental, social, and governance bonds, funds just exploding. I mean, we're seeing trillions of dollars flow into these areas. We're also seeing companies promise that they will be net zero. But one of the big issues with all of this is greenwashing. And that is like whitewashing. Are they just covering over something that's really not all that green or environmentally sound and just putting that label on it? It's a little like if you go to the market and you want organic, thinking they're pesticide-free blueberries, and organic is slapped on there, and then you learn, well, that doesn't really mean pesticide-free. It's, a problem. So we need to make sure we understand what these promises are before we invest in that, if we really want to make sure that our investments are green. So that's the focus of this. May require new regulation, and it's informed a bit by my experience as a prosecutor of fraud as well as a judge, that we need to make sure that people are actually fulfilling the promises as would be commonly understood when they make that statement.
I just love that whole concept. There's some sort of TV show like Greenwashing, and you're on trial, and you have a prosecutor sort of, this is all the greenwashing. That'd actually be pretty entertaining. You could probably learn a lot. But I don't think you mentioned this is coming out in a particular art journal, or what's the?
Oh, it just came out as a opinion piece. I wrote it with Jennifer Nash, who was at the Harvard Business School, and it just came out as an opinion piece in The Hill.
Okay, well, we're going to get you back on and probably have a longer conversation about that whole topic in general. So, Alice, again, fantastic. It's always a treat to have you on Simpatico, and appreciate you making the time. I'm going to bring you to Just Chatting, but thanks again for the work that you're doing. You're just a leader in this field, and so it's always a treat.
Oh, thank you. You're way too kind. Thank you.
Okay, we'll be right back.